Emma had always found the old library where she worked to have a unique charm. It was a place of reverent silence, with shelves filled with books that had seen generations of readers. The smell of aged paper and the soft light filtering through the frosted glass windows created an almost magical ambience. One particularly quiet day, while cataloging some old volumes that had been donated from a private collection, Emma came across a book that didn't seem to belong in the library's collection. It was hidden behind a stack of worn tomes and looked out of place. The cover was made of a material that looked like aged leather, and the title, which seemed to be in an ancient language, was engraved in barely legible gold letters. There was no visible author or publication date, and the sensation Emma felt upon touching it was one of unexpected chill, as if the book itself were imbued with a cold, distant presence. Intrigued, Emma picked up the book and placed it on her desk in her office. She sat down to examine it more calmly, and soon realized that the book was filled with yellowed and worn pages. The content seemed to be a mix of text and illustrations, some of which evoked dark and enigmatic images. She opened a page at random and began to read, her curiosity overcoming her uneasiness. At that moment, a light breeze passed through the room, even with the windows closed, and the light from the lamp seemed to flicker briefly. Emma continued reading, immersing herself in the words that seemed to carry an indescribable weight. Each page she turned seemed to whisper secrets that she was not ready to hear. She felt a chill as she read, as if a shadow had crossed the room. After finishing her first reading, Emma carefully placed the book back on the table and covered it with a cloth. She decided that she needed to research more about the volume and its origins before sharing it with anyone. In the days that followed, Emma could not get the book out of her head. The sense of unease she had felt when reading the first few pages continued to haunt her. She decided to investigate the book's origins, looking through old records and library catalogs. However, her research revealed nothing relevant. The book seemed to be an anomaly, a lost piece of time. That afternoon, while Emma was working at the library, her colleague and friend, Mark, came into her office to discuss a cataloging project. Mark was a young book enthusiast and was always willing to help Emma with any task. Seeing him, Emma remembered the book and decided to mention it. "Mark, have you seen this book?" Emma asked, pulling the volume out from under the cloth and placing it on the table. Mark looked at the book curiously and noted its old, worn appearance. "No, I haven't. It looks really interesting. Did you find it somewhere special?" he asked, flipping through the pages without actually reading them. Emma was about to answer when her phone rang. It was a quick call, an update on a technical issue she needed to resolve. Mark, already accustomed to these interruptions, decided to get a coffee while he waited. Less than an hour later, Emma received a text message that alarmed her. Mark had been in a car accident. He was in critical condition in the hospital. Emma felt a chill down her spine when she read the news. She tried to contact him, but her calls went straight to voicemail. The news of Mark's accident came as a profound shock. Emma felt a growing guilt as she thought about the book he had seen. The connection seemed absurd, but the coincidence was undeniable. She felt a crushing weight as she considered that the book could be related to what had happened. That night, Emma lay awake, revisiting the page Mark had looked at. Her thoughts were jumbled, and the guilt she felt for having shown him the book was almost paralyzing. She decided that she needed to know more about the book and what was behind the tragic events that had begun to unfold. The following days were a torment for Emma. Mark recovered from the accident, but his condition was a constant reminder of the mysterious book. Emma tried to convince herself that it was all just a coincidence, but the guilt wouldn't leave her. She decided that the only way to deal with it was to delve deeper into the book. In order to unravel the mystery, Emma began reading the book more often, taking care not to leave any pages blank. But to her horror, each time she read a new passage, a tragic event seemed to occur. The pattern was unmistakable. The pages of the book seemed to anticipate and somehow trigger personal calamities. Early the following week, an acquaintance at the library, Laura, suffered a serious loss. Laura had recently lost a loved one and was struggling to cope with her grief. After Emma read a page that mentioned loss and grief, Laura was diagnosed with a rare and incurable terminal illness. Emma was distraught, and to make matters worse, her colleagues and acquaintances began to suffer unexplained tragedies. The incidents included accidents, illnesses, and personal losses. With each new reading, a new calamity seemed to follow. Feeling increasingly frightened and guilty, Emma sought to understand what was happening. She made a list of the tragic events in the pages she had read to identify any possible correlations. The pattern was clear. The book seemed to be drawing out the suffering and tragedy of the lives of those around her. Meanwhile, Emma began to notice changes in her own behavior. She became more withdrawn and anxious, always fearful that her next reading would trigger more suffering. Her nights were filled with nightmares and a constant feeling that something was about to happen. Emma decided that she had to stop reading the book, but every time she tried to put it down, she felt an almost irrational urge to return to it, as if she were being controlled by an invisible force. Fear and guilt consumed her, and the feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. At that point, Emma knew she needed help, but she was terrified of sharing what she knew with anyone. Guilt and the fear that the book might cause more harm to others kept her from taking action. However, she knew that she could not continue like this, and the desire to solve the mystery and put an end to the tragedy began to become her only concern. Desperate to understand the nature of the book and in the series of tragedies, Emma dedicated herself to investigating its origins. One rainy afternoon, while looking through the old archives of the library, she came across a volume of records that named the author of the mysterious book. His name was Dr. Elias Blackwood, a 19th-century writer and occultist. Research revealed that Blackwood was known for his esoteric practices and his experimentation with texts that promised supernatural powers. Emma discovered an article detailing a dark pact that Blackwood had made with an unknown entity. According to the records, Blackwood used the book to capture and manipulate human suffering, feeding the entity with the energy generated by pain and despair. As she read through the disturbing details, Emma came across a page that described the book as an instrument of vengeance, used to lure and punish those who sought power without understanding its consequences. The book had the ability to manifest tragedies in people's lives, with the sole purpose of empowering the entity that possessed it. The entity, described as an ancient, malevolent force, fed on suffering to gain power and expand. Emma was horrified by the discovery. She understood that the book was not just a source of disturbing reading, but an artifact that had a real and devastating impact on those who interacted with it. The pages were a channel for suffering and fear, turning each reading into a tragic event. Determined to lift the curse, Emma began searching for a way to neutralize the book. She found references to ancient rituals and procedures that could be used to seal or destroy the book, but these methods were complicated and required occult knowledge she did not possess. The sense of urgency grew as the number of tragedies continued to mount and the weight of guilt became increasingly unbearable. Emma knew she had to act quickly. With the information she had gathered, she began to formulate a plan to deal with the book and the entity. The choices were difficult and the risk was great, but she could delay no longer. The only option was to face the entity and attempt to reverse the harm the book had caused. With her plan in mind, Emma prepared to face the entity that had been fueled by the suffering the book had generated. However, preparation was not easy. The ritual to neutralize the book required a secluded space, a specific set of items, and a concentration of mental and emotional strength that Emma feared she lacked. She chose a moonless night, when darkness seemed to envelop the library even more densely. In the center of a deserted room, Emma arranged a circle of salt and placed candles along its edge. In the center of the circle sat the book, wrapped in a dark cloth. The atmosphere was charged with an almost palpable tension. As she prepared to begin the ritual, Emma felt a growing presence. The lights began to flicker, and a cold breeze swept through the room, even with the windows tightly closed. The air seemed to vibrate with a dark energy. Emma tried to focus, following the instructions she had found, but fear and anxiety threatened to unsettle her. As she began to read the words of the ritual aloud, the room grew even colder. The candles flickered and a hissing sound filled the space, as if something unseen was manifesting itself. Emma struggled to remain calm, but the presence of the entity was overwhelming. The book seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, and she realized that she was actually facing the entity described in the texts. Suddenly, a shadow formed in the center of the circle. It was a hazy figure, a nebulous presence that emanated a sense of pure evil. Emma felt paralyzing fear, but she continued with the ritual, reciting the words with growing determination. The entity seemed to react with anger. The shadow stirred, and a distorted voice whispered in her ear, promising more suffering and despair if she continued. Emma tried to ignore the threats and focused on finishing the ritual. With a final cry of determination, she spoke the final words, and a burst of light shone in the circle. The shadow twisted and then disappeared, leaving the room in an oppressive silence. Emma was exhausted and shaken, but felt a sense of relief when she realized that the entity had been banished, if only temporarily. The book was now silent, without the sinister pulse it had previously had. Emma knew that, although the ritual had apparently worked, the book and the entity could return. However, for now, the evil was contained. She decided that it would be best to seal the book in a safe place, where no one could find it or use it again. The sense of relief was accompanied by a deep sense of exhaustion and reflective sadness. Emma knew that, although she had broken the cycle of suffering, the experience had scarred her forever. The morning sun was breaking when Emma woke up, still exhausted from the previous night's ritual. The library was quiet and peaceful, and the sense of peace was almost palpable. She felt relieved that she had managed to temporarily neutralize the entity, but the weight of her recent experiences was still present. Emma decided that the best thing to do would be to ensure that the book could do no more harm. Carefully, she sealed the volume in a locked safe, placing it in a safe place where no one would find it. It was a relief to think that the book was out of reach, although Emma knew that the harm it had caused could not be erased so easily. That afternoon, Emma went to the hospital to visit Mark and Laura. Both were recovering, but the emotional and physical scars of the tragedies were evident. Emma tried to find words of comfort, but felt that nothing she could say would truly do justice to the suffering that had been caused. They greeted her with a mixture of relief and discomfort, as if they too felt the weight of Emma's guilt. After the visit, Emma returned to the library and spent some time reflecting on everything that had happened. Sitting in her office, she revisited the old records she had studied and reflected on the story of Dr. Elias Blackwood and the entity he had conjured. The experience had profoundly changed her perception of the world and the limits of human knowledge. Although the book was now safe, Emma knew that the experience had left a lasting mark on her. The guilt and fear she had felt during the events lingered like a constant shadow. She understood that the real battle was not just with the entity, but with the fear and sense of helplessness she had faced. On a more positive note, Emma decided that she would dedicate her time to sharing her experience anonymously to help prevent others from falling into the same trap. She would write an account of what had happened, without revealing specific details of the book or the entity, but warning of the dangers of seeking power and knowledge without understanding its consequences. As she closed her office and prepared to leave the library for the last time, Emma looked at the books around her with a new perspective. The library, with its tranquility and beauty, now seemed like a more precious refuge than ever. With one last glance at the vault where the book was kept, Emma knew that although she had faced an evil force, peace and balance had been restored, at least for now.